time we're going to hear from Eric Altena from the Minnesota DNR, who is not based in St. Paul. He's based in he is based in the Little Falls area. He's going to tell us about history of the Little Rock Lake area and project that he was involved with in Lake Drawdown, um, using reservoir level manipulation as a tool to help with that water quality and habitat. Eric describes himself as an East Coast transplant, which must have been rather painful, with a love of fishing and bow hunting, and still plays hockey, which is actually pretty amazing. He has had an interest in fisheries since the 7th grade and now has a 31-year career in fisheries management. 23 of those years here in the state of Minnesota. He has an education of a Bachelor of Science degree from Colorado State University and got his MS from Texas A&M. He
Don't hold that against me.
He has 4 awesome children and 2 awesome dogs. So, Eric, hey, great to have you with us, and looking forward to hear what you have to say about the Lake Drawdown project. Take it away.
Sure. Well, thank you, Mark, so much for the invite and the opportunity to kind of tell a story here. And that's honestly what it is. This is not necessarily highfalutin statistics or modeling or anything like that. This is literally a management action to try and address some water quality issues. So I don't know how many of you might be familiar. We'll talk about this here in a second, but if you ever drive up Highway 10, and there's a little area just north of St. Cloud and south of Rice, and you cross over this causeway, a bridge, and it says Little Rock Lake right there. And the lake is oftentimes algal filled, like to the point where it's a pasty substance on the surface. And that's the lake that we're talking about. So just north of St. Cloud, south of Rice, and it's attached to the Mississippi River. And one of the earlier surveys, as I point out in the first slide here, submerged vegetation was present in great variety and abundance, much of it usually present in lakes of cool temperatures and clear water. It's a little bit different story, isn't it? Numerous other marsh plants grow. So we had dominant emergent vegetation and submerged vegetation, and this was back in the 1948 survey. So we did an initial survey out there in 1948, and things have changed quite a bit. It is a reservoir, and no, this is not a golf course green. I'm hoping everybody can see the slide okay. This is actually Little Rock Lake, and it is an impoundment of the Mississippi River. There is a dam down in Sartell that causes the lake to be about 7 feet higher. So we'll talk about that here in a second. So yeah, what's the problem? This is the problem. There's not too many lakes around the state where you see algal blooms that are quite like this. This was pre-drawdown. 2007 was by far one of the peak years where we had algal blooms that were this bad. And thankfully, that's not happening as much anymore. But this is kind of the story. There was a point where the reservoir kind of hung around this below 200 level. We had drought conditions, we had runoff conditions, we had high rain and everything else, to the point where we had over 600 parts per billion of phosphorus at one point. It had been declining since then. The TMDL went into effect in 2012. And since that time, the SWCD in both Morrison and Benton counties have been doing quite a bit of work that reduced the overall phosphorus loading coming into the lake. The problem was, and even the TMDL suggested, that internal loading is a large component. So what do? What do we try and do? Well, my idea was to try and say, let's try and manipulate, even though we know it's down at the bottom end of the reservoir, or bottom end of the Little Rock Creek watershed. We know that there's some actions that we could take that might help address some of those water quality issues, and it's generally a shallow lake. So a drawdown is what I'd proposed, and I'm talking about a reservoir management tool that hopefully can address water quality and fish habitat concerns. So about the resource, Little Rock Lake is a 1,300 acre reservoir basically off of the Mississippi River, which is in Sartell. That alone, that pool that it's impounded is also 1,300 plus acres. So we have 2,600 acres of water that are impounded by a dam in Sartell that's used for hydroelectric generation. So Mississippi River Sartell Dam was constructed in 1907, actually elevated in 26. That pool, as I mentioned, 1,386 acres, and it's a giant hydroelectric facility at 4 megawatt generation, which is obviously tongue in cheek. The lake itself was formerly a wetland in Little Rock Creek, and it probably encompassed less than 600 acres. Now it's over 1,300, and 96% of it are littoral. It was one of the early places where we had cabin development. So, you know, when people come up from the cities, they would drive about an hour up, and this is one of the earlier places where we had cabins, and many of those were not very well thought out, we'll just say. So the entire west shore is actually developed. The east shore is not. It's an extremely flat pool. In other words, that the slope of the actual reservoir throughout the river is very, very flat until you get up near Rice anyway. There's a 70,000 acre watershed for Little Rock Lake itself, and that changed significantly since the early days of development. This slide kind of points that out. We have pre-settlement vegetation that suggests that it was a lot of shrub, wetland, even forested area within the 70,000 acre watershed for Little Rock Lake. Since that time, things changed quite a bit, and anyone that's driven along the transition zone throughout Minnesota can see that there's been changes. You know, the tree lines have gone down, the increase in corn and bean production and stuff, and the increase in irrigation in this particular watershed in particular made things challenging. The other piece of the puzzle is that this actually happens to be the northern lobe of the Anoka sand plain, and that sediment is very mobile. So that causes problems in and of itself, that it carries those wonderful nutrients that are being applied to the landscape, whether it's in the form of um, uh, manure or actual application of other chemicals to increase plant growth. So the other piece of the puzzle is that we wanted to see the plant growth that was there back in the day. In 1938, this is already 30 years post-impoundment, there was still quite a bit of emergent vegetation in many areas around the lake. And this is just kind of one of the pinpoint things that's easy enough to see. The Highway 10 corridors there on your left, and you have a black and white photo from 38 and a more recent photo from 2016 or so, and it basically shows that we lost a lot of the emergent vegetation. So why a 3-foot drawdown? Well, as I mentioned, 96% of the lake is less than 15 feet deep, and of that, there's these large flats that extend out quite a ways. That's less than 4 feet of water. And one of the ways that we thought is that we could try and simulate the drought, have sun air exposure to better part of 700 acres. And we knew we'd get a system flush, so to speak, and consolidation of sediments if the drying did occur. We knew that we'd get some plant growth. We know it uses nutrients, increases stability, increases fish habitat. Those are all potentials. This new reservoir phenomenon, also known as flipping to a stable clear state, there's two alternative states for most shallow lake systems, and that's what we were counting on, is that we could get a clear water state with abundant vegetation, or we'd have a turbid water state with abundant algal growth. So the TMDL, as I mentioned, suggested that we have internal loading component as a major deal, and this is just working off that stable clear state. Reservoir management has been used long time throughout history and in the United States as well as worldwide. But in this country in particular, we've tried to restore some lakes, at least by using it in a shallow lake system. We've done it in Minnesota in many different scenarios, but not necessarily on a popular reservoir system. We do know that there's a lack of habitat in the lake, and that's certainly something we wanted to try and address. So what are some examples of drawdown growth? Well, this is what we were hoping for, right? We know that once you expose that soil, that moist soil that you typically end up with plant growth. That's something like what you see in the photos. And we had an example just upstream. There is a small reservoir that's managed by our wildlife counterparts. It's called the Sartell Wildlife Management Area. And they did a drawdown in 2003 and got significant plant growth in a matter of just a couple weeks. And I was counting on that. That would be, okay, maybe this is ideal, but the time frame, looked right. Everything looked right. And that's the kind of growth that they got in the WMA. Now, that's a little bit different in the lake, but nonetheless, we were counting on this data here to suggest that, we know that we can change the average SECI to increase it. So what we're looking at here is a graph from left to right showing the individual lake, the pre-drawdown measurements for both SECI and phosphorus, and then the post drawdown measurements. And some of them have had multiple, measurements over the years, like Lake Maria in that case. And the positive thing there is that, yes, we had an increase in SECI transparency and a decrease in phosphorus. And that's how I basically brought it to the public and sold them on it. Now, the timeline is long established, and I actually started in this office in 2008. The TMDL was established in 2012. The paper mill explosion occurred in 2012. SWCDs and ag practices, they tried to get things going. As I mentioned, they reduced some of the other the inputs, and money was spent in the watershed, quite a bit of it, and has been continued actually throughout since that time. I had actually first suggested to the Little Rock Lake Association in the winter of 2013 that, hey, you know what? If you really want to do something to address the water quality, let's look at a drawdown. It's one method that I think might be a positive thing. And they literally looked at me like I was from outer space. They were like, what are you kidding me? We want to drop the water down? What are you talking about? And I explained to them at the time, I was like, you know what? All natural lakes have this ebb and flow based on drought conditions and rain events and stuff like that. And here on this reservoir, it has been maintained at one level for over 100 years. One level, 100 years. There's not very many systems that you can say have had that. It's bumped up on occasion, but never has it drawn down other than one emergency event, and that was back in the 90s, where it actually, or 70s actually, where it did drop, and then they bumped it right back up within a matter of a week or whatever. So it's only had one instance in the entire history where it's dropped in level. It's always done some minor increases, but maintained it at around at the same elevation. So again, I keep trying to punch the message through after 14 and 15, et cetera. Eagle Creek, which is another hydro company, they purchased it, and there was an interim company that had treated the dam in Sartell from its own mill capacity to generating electricity for the grid. Eagle Creek purchased that hydroelectric facility, and that was in 2015. I'd presented again to the Rice Area Sportsman's Club, the Little Rock Lake Association, St. Cloud, City of St. Cloud, the City of Sartell, the Anoka Sand Partnership, both in 15 and 16. And then I did a public information meeting in 2016. And I'll tell you what, if you mail out postcards to folks and say, you know what, we might be taking your water away for about 6 weeks or so, what do you think? You'll get a lot of people to show up. That much I know. We had filled one of the town halls in Rice to the point where people were asking a lot of questions, and I think it helped to try and get the people out at least understanding what the purpose or the idea was. So I'd suggested this even back in 2016. We had more public information and input meetings in 17, a legislative update that I went down to St. Paul and said, hey, here's an idea for trying to do some things. SWCD did get the funding in December of 2017 from the Clean Water Act, or Clean Water Partnership that we have available here in Minnesota, Clean Water Legacy. SWCDs reduced the phosphorus input by more than 2,500 pounds per year as of 2017. As of 2020, we're talking almost 4,000 pounds of phosphorus reduction in the overall incoming water. So that's pretty impressive, and the watershed. We had public hearings, official public hearings in spring of 2018. We had actually planned for spring or August of 2018, and then we had SHPO related issues that delayed us until 2019. they wanted some alternatives. So we did some research. We had some meetings to try and say, okay, what are some things that we could look at? Well, what about filtration, filtering the inputs and saying, well, maybe that's the issue of or source of our problem. And I tried to explain to them, well, the internal loading we know is a major component. So that's what we should focus on, but we'll look at these. So we know that filtration has limited application, and obviously there are some concerns for whether or not it'll be plugging. It's a very high dollar expenditure, and we know that the incoming flows cannot be that high without having some impacts. What about reed islands? Well, basically the same concept as increasing wetland surface area, but unfortunately, in all the cases that this has been done, it's been on small ponds or small lakes, and you need to basically have about 50% of the surface area to be able to be effective in treating phosphorus within the lake itself. Barley straw bales. This is kind of one of those farmers' legacy type things, where they'll put barley straw in as a way to enable a reaction that prevents algal growth. Well, that's great, but you're not really addressing the problem, nor has it been effective in any large scale at all. At the scale that you'd have to put it in, it would have to be, again, cover about half of the lake surface, and that's 1,300 acres. So not exactly feasible. What about dredging? Well, that's always brought up. Well, you just simply get the sediments out of there and then you won't have any problem anymore. Well, let's talk about cost on trying to do it. And is it really something that we want to address? Um, you know, Dredging has been so effective in Clear Lake in Iowa. Yeah, not so much. They've been doing it for almost 20 years at the cost of several $1 million and have yet to see improvements in their water quality. So I kind of sold them on the fact that, what, it sounds like a good idea. And honestly, if we could figure out a way to get it back up onto the fields where it came from through hydraulic type methods or something like that, and at low cost, I'd maybe it'd be a consideration. But there's a lot of other issues and permitting associated with that. What about an alum treatment? Well, this is popular in some deeper lakes. It can be expensive, Obviously, we're talking more than 900 acres that's greater than 6 feet. So at least $400,000, which is quite a bit more than this project cost. And we have a lake that is 96% littoral, so less than 15 feet deep. And we know we get a significant wind mixing out there. Alum has definitely been shown that we need a surface or a space in the lake that if we're going to cap it for some time, even if it's temporary, whatever, it needs to be deep enough that we're not going to cause turbulence and mix it up. So we knew that wind mixing would be a problem. The other alternative that was suggested and or looked into was, what about a cofferdam or a temporary dam of some kind at the Gordon's Bridge, which is at the downstream end of the actual lake before it goes into the river. So we looked at that. People said, well, this way you wouldn't have to impact the river owners, all right? So one piece of information that I'd probably be helpful is that we have over 830 landowners along this reservoir area, all right, that would be impacted if the water level is drawn down. 830. You think you get enough opinions with just 5 people in a room? Try talking to 830 different residents and seeing what they think. And this is why some of these alternatives and thought processes came out. So many meetings and different, you know, um, options had to be at least looked at and say, okay, here's why we might not consider it and what's the most feasible option. So the cofferdam thing is definitely, it was one thing of consideration, but we knew that the permitting was an issue, and we also know that there's a high risk of flooding because we were talking about 300 some odd residents that live on the lake itself. If you cannot drop the dam down in the event of a major rain event or something, you're actually going to cause flooding. Nobody wants to be liable for that, and I certainly wasn't willing to do that either. So just to kind of give you a little bit of a frame of reference, the lake is up on the upper kind of north part of that, and then the Mississippi River and the railroad trestle, Gordon's Bridge area right down here in the middle, right where those indicators are. So this is kind of the project they thought. I looked at the cost for doing this, and maybe even maintaining what they call a dammit dam. But basically, it's a water-filled tube that would be a temporary option. But even that, you couldn't release quick enough without doing something. Sheet pile is obviously a different story. We have to have mechanical installation, a big deal, and pretty expensive. So what were the expected outcomes? Well, we'd hoped for significant plant growth along shoreline areas and mudflats, and then we were hoping for within the next year or two that we'd see increased submerged vegetation as well. We were hoping for a reduction of phosphorus. We were likely suggesting greater than 30% reduction in phosphorus. Increased water clarity. We were hoping for at least a 50% or more increase in water clarity and increased fish habitat. Obviously, if we're talking about plant growth and water clarity, increasing some of that submerged plant growth, we'd have significant year class production of bass, bluegill, crappie in the following year or years as it might be. And then we'd also hope that the flows that would go out, coming out and then coming back in would cause some scouring within the Harris Channel. That's that narrow part before it goes into the Mississippi River. That would aid in navigation because it is kind of shallow going through certain portions of it. So what did we come up with? Well, we had a reduction in phosphorus for an average of around 300 parts per billion or 200 parts per billion, even in some of the later years, to less than 100 parts per billion following the drawdown. That was pretty impressive, honestly. We weren't sure what to expect, but we know we had a positive thing going on there. So one of the things that I pointed out to folks is I offered this up, and my original proposal was let's do a drawdown in July and August. And I suggested doing 2 months, 2 full months during the peak growing months, in Minnesota. Well, boy, we got all kinds of arguments against it. It was like, well, I think we should narrow it down because, the power company, they need, X amount of money to be able to generate their electricity. And if they're down and out, then what do we do? And that's what the grant was basically for, is to compensate the hydroelectric facility for their downtime during that time. They can only operate at full pool elevation. That's one of the beauties of having a 1926 construction and a 1907 based hydroelectric facility, is that there is no variable crest that allows it to operate at lower levels without damage to the equipment. That's unfortunate. So I had these sideboards that the river people were saying, well, we don't want to draw down during July because that's our peak month of use. And the lake people are like, well, we don't want to draw down in June because then, we don't even get to use the lake during that first part. And so nobody wanted it during that time frame. The power companies, least amount of use occurs from August through October. That's when flows generally are lower, so they wouldn't have as much impact then. We ended up with this August time frame that was not ideal, but one of the things that we did find out is that in 2019, we had more rain and cooler weather during that time frame, and it probably restricted some of the plant growth to a larger extent. We did have increased water clarity. We went from less than a foot on average in most months to greater than 8'6", but we had a greater than 6 foot this past June. So 8'6" water clarity in the middle of June on Little Rock Lake is unheard of. I don't know if anybody's been by there is familiar with the resource, but certainly 8'6" was something I was like, I don't believe this. This is amazing. So we did get that goal. We did get the increased fish habitat. We did do follow-up surveys with floating leaf and emergent mapping and submerged point intercept mapping, both 20 and 21. And we had an increase, and we also had a pre-survey 2005 that we had an increase of over 65% in submerged vegetation. Now, granted, some of that was going to be in curly-leaf pondweed, which is to be expected in a shallow lake system like this. However, any vegetation in a system that barely has any is good. So the Harris Channel, we did get some increased scour due to the flows, and I'm actually going to be remapping that this spring, this coming spring, to kind of get a final on that deal. So what was accomplished as well during this whole time frame? Well, we have information and outreach to community. This is something that was a big deal. I talked so many times and gave similar talks trying to explain the rationale for doing a drawdown, the importance for trying to address some of this internal loading stuff, and explaining that it's not just septic systems, folks. It really isn't. We have a history and a legacy of nutrients that are sitting within the basin that we need to try and address it in some way, shape, or form. And this is one way that allows us to do that without expending a ton of money. We had a coordination and planting of 45,000 native emergent plants. So people around the lake actually got into this quite a bit. And one of the pictures here on the lower left kind of shows some folks that we're organizing and distributing these 45,000 plants. We had some that the state purchased and some that private landowners purchased. So people really got into it, and we've seen an increase and some success from mostly the private stuff, but extensive cleanup efforts around it. So when the lake was down, lots of things got, exposed, and people found out that, what, this is a good thing. We arranged for dumpsters around the area and had a huge community involvement in this process of doing the cleanup and giving a crap basically about the lake. Hundreds of pictures. I set up a Google shared drive area, whatever, to be able to upload photos to, and it was pretty cool to see the interactive type stuff going on there and people taking tons of pictures. I took tons of pictures, obviously, and there's many others. But the trash, oh my gosh, it was amazing how much stuff was found in there. And I literally, the picture on the lower right had boatloads of stuff that we found, and helped haul out to the dumpster locations or whatever. The other kind of unique thing is that this headstone was found, that was supposed to be located quite a bit west in Foston, Minnesota. And we don't know how it ended up there. Maybe somebody's, you know, party evening decided to end up in chunking this thing over the ice, or we don't know. But nonetheless, it was found. Excuse me. And that actually made a story on Channel 5 News or whatever. It was kind of an interesting deal and sort of one of those unique things. And then um, dead deer, right? So clearly, when you see dead deer, you associate that with a drawdown, right? Well, there is the accusation there that because, and if you do any of the reading here, EHD um, had been found for one of the first few times in the state of Minnesota, and it happened to be just southwest of the Rice Bridge. Now, I know that many people will say, well, because of the drawdown, obviously the deer are dead. That's all there is to it, right? Well, the interesting thing is that we only had these dead deer to the southwest. There's about 100 or so that did die. It's legit, and it was EHD. Um, but it was in one area around the drawdown. Now we know that the midges are ubiquitous throughout the entire state, but they do become more prevalent in drought years. So they definitely made that association. The public did. This is a post on Facebook with some comments that were kind of creative, we'll just say. So, needless to say, my my mug was in the sights, so to speak, of many hunters around the area saying, how stupid are you? Let the government stick their noses in stuff, and this is their freaking outcome. Sue them. How do you like that? Yeah, that was an entertaining time. We'll just say that. And needless to say, I had to try and explain. Look, we've not seen them everywhere around the drawdown area. That would be a common thought, is that these midges are going to be, you know, found around the entire area, not just in one select wetland area near St. Stephen. So, nonetheless, a challenge and one of those things that was unexpected when I was doing the whole drawdown stuff. I will say that. So, this is a kind of a gauge of stuff, and one of the still cams that we had up that kind of shows the progress. The idea is that we want to just show people that, look, this is what it looks like. There's kind of some unique things. It took almost 17 days to get to the full drawdown level we were hoping for. We never actually got the 3 feet low in Little Rock Lake. It was 2.7 feet below normal pool elevation. And one of the interesting things you see from the still cam video here is this, this is obviously taken almost hourly during daylight hours. And a lot of people like to kind of hike and bike and check stuff out. And everybody was, kind of checking this thing out. This is not too far from the Highway 10 bridge. So there was readily available access there. And people got a kick out of checking things out when there was mud flats. So um, nonetheless, it was interesting. So to me, this is kind of telling, and it's just a neat way to show people that, yeah, we did get some growth and things that did change. People even smiled for the camera and stuff, which was I was surprised it didn't get vandalized, to be honest. But nonetheless, it's kind of interesting, and when you see stuff here, it's pretty cool. So just another way to look at things. So what are some of the learning experience? Well, huge projects like this one, honestly, it takes a lot longer than anybody would ever suggest. And I know some of you are familiar with doing larger projects like this, where you're involved in a watershed planning scheme or whatever, and you think it's never going to end, or whatever. You started on it, many years ago, and now you're still moving on it. Well, that's true. There's no question that big projects take longer than you think. The more landowners, no surprise here, that the more opinions there are, and just kind of like I alluded to in some of the meetings, we had some pretty colorful and creative comments, and I certainly was the butt of a few jokes. I'll just say that. But 830 parcel owners, and we had to get a permission basically from them to do the drawdown because it is public waters. So there's this 103G.408 statute that requires us to get a permission from 75% of the landowners, and we were able to do away with that in that particular language, but we did an opt-out version of it. So in other words, we sent them a postcard and said, if you have problems with this drawdown, send this postcard back by X date, whatever. I don't remember what the exact date was, but that actually was considered or sufficed for our 75% acceptance, in that we didn't have more than 5 to, I think it was like 15 total comment cards and or comments that came back from the entire 830 parcel owners mailing list. So I felt pretty confident that, in spite of the fact that some people really hated my guts for wanting to do this thing, um, that there weren't that many that were willing to at least speak out on behalf of not doing the drawdown. So like I said, some people have unique expectations of what to expect in a drawdown. I had one gentleman suggest, what we should do? We should just put another dam in down by the Gordon's Bridge, and then you guys can do whatever the F you want with this thing, and we don't have to worry about you screwing around with our resource. So there was that, and then why don't you just dredge the channel? That'd be a piece of cake. Just get in there and dredge it. No, there's no permitting or what to do with the spoils, nothing like that, right? So some people thought that we would significantly alter the fishery and stuff, and to the point that it would destroy everything, both in the river and the lake. I mean, there was stuff that I was uniquely surprised by hearing from folks, and that's, like I said, what you get when you have 830 parcel owners and the general public now that's all wound up about these dead deer things. So I didn't expect to be personally criticized, and I should have, but it was certainly an eye-opening experience for me to get basically heckled, whether it's on Facebook or whether it's on Instagram or whether it's on the news or whatever. So it was kind of an interesting deal. And as I learned, the media can be friend and foe. We all know this, but until you see it in practice and stuff like that, that there's some times when things get misconstrued, and certainly that happened. One of the things that I learned is that you got to try and do your best to educate, even when you don't think you're getting through. Communicating that and being redundant about it are super, super important. Um, I only feel like I got through to folks because I started telling them about this in 2013, and I kept on saying, hey, this is something we should do. This is something we should do. This is something we should do. And I think it finally was like, okay, maybe we'll try and do this because we really have no other alternatives. So with that, I'll bring some pictures. The just on the very top there, that's kind of a panoramic shot of the Benton Beach area. That was post doing some planting and seeing some of the growth that actually occurred natively. It was pretty cool to see those expansive flats like that start sprouting some plant growth. On the as we're moving over on the left-hand side, this is an area that's known as the rock pile, and it's a shallow isthmus. That's the one I displayed earlier that had vegetation growing along that entire thing. Right now, there's nothing. We tried to do some planting out there, and it was successful at the time, but then geese, which I also hadn't factored into the equation, young geese in particular, like to nip off the top of the plants and pull the roots out. So that was kind of discouraging, that we found out after the fact. As you go farther on the left, right there at the Highway 10 bridge, this is what the drawdown kind of looked like at that lower basin. I had some contributors from some aerial photography folks and enthusiasts and professional photographers that were willing to donate some of their work and share it, which is kind of cool. And then we monitored fish during the entire time just to make sure that we didn't cause the problems that some people had suggested. And then on the far right, yes, plenty of tires, plenty of metal objects, and a lot of that came from within the lake, as well as even in the river areas. So pretty amazing that we had this kind of stuff. So some 21 updates. We had significant plant growth, believe it or not, and some stuff that even came up in 2021 after the fact. And it was pretty cool to see the clear water like we saw in June. As I mentioned, usually we would end up with about a foot of clarity or less by June, and this time we had 8'6", and this past year almost 7 feet of water clarity, which is pretty amazing. So pretty neat. As I mentioned, 8'6" and greater than 6 feet in 21. We actually found golden algae. So one of the unique aspects to being here just north of St. Cloud is that we do have St. Cloud State University, and there is some staff on hand that do some work. And Dr. Julius with St. Cloud State, he's kind of one of a specialist in not only microcystin algae, but also other forms of algae. And he had done some sampling and found that golden algae, which is more common to the river system than it is to the lake, which had not been found in the lake previously, was found after the drawdown. We did have a decrease in microcystin to the point that it was actually not found in 2021. That's per Dr. Julius's assessment anyway of looking at the microcystin algae, which is pretty amazing. So we still had a little bit of an algal bloom, but we did only have some green algae, not the microcystin, which is amazing. So it went from off the scale to non-existent, which even that's a big story, but yet it's something that a lot of people would just be like, whatever. So what else beyond that? Well, vegetation survey, the point intercept and the floating leaf emergent, we had a 65% increase in submerged vegetation. And then in 2020, we did a lake survey out there, and we had over 17 walleye per net, which is the highest in history for the lake and the highest in our area. Now, I wish I could take full credit for this, that it was all the drawdown and everything, right? But no. This is obviously, several years of natural reproduction that we have out there. We do not stock the lake with anything. We used to, but then we determined that it actually has natural reproduction. We know that with the connection to the lake, it has natural reproduction in lake and then also in the river. So we have plenty of options there. We had several good year classes that were coming through, and many walleye that actually were captured in our survey, which is pretty amazing. Electrofishing in 2021, and both years we had average walleye young of the year, right? That's what the YOI stands for, and that's okay. It's not to be unexpected. We have more clear water, maybe a little bit less survival in the lake itself, but we still have decent production of fish. We had significant increases in young of the year largemouth bass and black crappie and bluegill following the drawdown, which is pretty cool. And then we had an amazing crappie angling in the spring of 20 and 21. Now, some could argue that that was pandemic related or somewhat pandemic related, right? Because people had some spare time on their hands. They couldn't go to Canada. Fishing was an activity that was, socially distant and fairly safe. But the crappie were very cooperative. I'll just say that. So right around that area where the aerial photo was showing where the Highway 10 crossing is, there was over 150 people there at times just fishing for crappie right off of there and catching some decent size keepers, as it were. So pretty cool stuff, and something I'm definitely proud to be involved with, and I'm glad that we got it done. I wished we would have done it longer and more towards the summer, but I had these major sideboards that caused us to not have that option, and it was a little frustrating from a purely ecological and biological standpoint, but yet the process still had benefits. And I think we'll see continued improvement in the vegetation assemblages. The floating leaf and emergent vegetation shows that we actually had an increase in some of those private areas as well. About a 15% increase from the previous year, which is pretty cool because we went from 0 to 15% to 60% to almost 15% more than that. So we now have an emergent vegetation component that didn't even used to exist in the lake. So I'm happy with that. I'm happy to see the increase in submerged vegetation. We had northern water milfoil coming up in areas that we'd never seen it before. So this is good stuff, and I guess I'll leave it at that. I know there's probably a lot of unanswered questions, and I do my best to try and answer them that you might have. So I saw there was at least a couple comments that came up during the time. So with that, I'll take some questions. There's a familiar face, Amanda
Awesome.
Gurton. Hey.
Yeah, so let's see. Everyone is, of course, welcome if you would like to just unmute yourself and ask Eric any of your questions. We do have one question in the chat, but I don't know if it was addressed or not, from Ada about, let's see, is the water level in the lake back to pre-drawdown?
Yeah, we didn't have a choice with that. That was either do it or don't, right? So it's we had to go to full pool elevation for the hydroelectric facility to get back their production, and that was a mandate. That was part of the deal. We had to have low flow requirements, high flow requirements that would either cause us to shut down or not. And in this case, you know, we had an agreement with them that we would do the drawdown from August 1 through September 15th. And they could be at full pool elevation by September 15th. And they had the ability to manipulate that. In a matter of 2.5 days, it filled up. So, yeah.
Yeah, hello, Erica. This is Phil Votruba with the PCA.
Oh, geez.
You did a really nice job. Nice presentation. I really enjoyed it.
I'm
I was
glad.
just curious on the drought this year, how that impacted
Yeah.
the project.
I wish we didn't have it, you know, because it kind of augments everything that you think was positive. And then, you know, we basically had a pot of boiling resident phosphorus right in the lake. Okay. And we know that, you know, drought conditions are tough even on marginal basins. If we talk about a basin like Little Rock, which already has this kind of, you know, higher end phosphorus loading, even with the drawdown stuff, it still had, you know, around that, I don't know, we end up with like 68 to 95, even over 100 or whatever at times of parts per billion of phosphorus, even after the drawdown. So we know we're already at that high end of the spectrum, even for Corn Belt Plains region type stuff, right? So we did have an algal bloom. It was fairly significant, but it was green algae, and we did not have the pasty stuff on the surface. So there's still, even in spite of the drought, even in, you know, this I guess you could call it somewhat historic, right? Because we haven't seen something like that since '88. We still had relatively decent water clarity, even though the clarity wasn't great. There wasn't the sludge on the surface, which is I consider that a positive. Some might not. They still say it's green and it didn't work, whatever. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks.
Yep.
Looks like we have another question in the chat for you, Eric. Ada is wondering, how frequently would this process need to be done to keep the clarity of the water?
Yeah, that is a big question, one of which I wish I had the answer to, but something I've asked Benton County SWCD, which Amanda used to be a part of and did a great job, by the way. So I got to give her some kudos, Amanda Gurton there. But nonetheless, I've asked Benton SWCD, Jerry Machi, to basically set up a panel, right? An advisory panel that would include lake association folks and lake residents, as well as river residents, and hopefully some local sportsmen, to come up with some of the criteria. What is it going to take for us to consider another drawdown? How are we going to fund it? What are the steps that would need to be involved? Is there a better timing that we could do? All those questions. I don't want to be the one that answers those this time. I promoted this thing and I tried to sell it, and thankfully we got buy-in from a lot of our great partners, the Lake Association, obviously the SWCDs were very supportive, and we thankfully had support from the Clean Water Legacy. But what do we do in the future? So my idea is to not have it on one individual like me, because I don't want to be that target person anymore. I've got 21 years or 23 years in here with the DNR, and I would like to stay off of the radar a little bit. I don't know, maybe not, but nonetheless, I think it'd be a good idea if we distributed that out to a committee or a panel or whatever that would suggest, hey, maybe we should think about it again. Water clarity's turned to crap, or phosphorus has gone up through the roof again, or maybe we just need to do it again because we want to increase plant growth and fish habitat. But I'm not going to be the one that suggests exactly when. I would like to see a summer drawdown, and ideally we do it for an entire year, but I don't think that'll ever fly. So to answer your question, it won't be easy, but I suspect within the next 7 to 10 years, we should probably do it again.
Hi, Eric. This is Karen Evans. I have a question for you about the vegetation piece of this.
Yeah.
Folks had a really great opportunity to participate in Watershed Science. I mean, this is just a stunning project that you managed to bring to fruition. Have you observed in people's perspectives a new attitude now about shallow lakes and near shore vegetation? A lot of the things that people always want to eliminate, they want that kind of pristine urban look. And, did this translate into a better attitude going forward about what a shallow lake is and the importance of vegetation in that shallow lake?
I feel like it did. I think you can talk to many of the Lake Association members, and I'm sure Amanda could probably chime in on this too. Um, the energy and the involvement was huge, and I can't I can't even describe that when you get 70 some odd lake folks that want to plant stuff around a lake that doesn't have much. And I was very emphatic about saying, hey, um, we have less than 10 acres, not even that, of emergent vegetation on this lake. Lakes of similar size and in this area of the country, even in the state of Minnesota, have better part of several hundred acres of vegetation, of emergent vegetation. So I think maybe just hammering that home a little bit gave some feeling to it, and I think there was a lot of energy. And I believe there's several people that are obviously convinced because they did the planting and they took care of it like it was their babies. It was pretty amazing. Yet you're always going to have those people that just want the riprap shoreline, the mowed down to the edge and all that stuff. I can't change those folks that are on the extreme end, right? But we did see a bunch of folks that at least understood that plants are valuable and that they even wanted to do the planting. We had people doing planting all around the lake, and even people asking after the drone, hey, where can I still get some plants? So I would say yes, there's definitely some folks that appreciated it, but there's always going to be those that percentage that isn't going to like it no matter what. So
Do you think your panel will include that element as well? So besides the drawdown concern, will they continue to think about the habitat elements as another part of the program where they would continue to assess shoreline, especially since the Score Your Shore package is such an easy way to do that.
yeah,
They could kind of keep that finger on the pulse of what's going on pretty easily.
yeah. I wish I could say I 100% think so, but I know the sportsmen around the area realize it. They know the value of it, right? But here's a interesting dichotomy. Um, I have a lake resident that he operates several different duck blinds over on the east side of the lake, the largest portion of the lake. Now, as a duck hunter, right, I've hunted ducks as well. I would appreciate having a lot of emergent vegetation, particularly something like wild rice, which, interestingly enough, we had native stands, not many, but a few native stands of wild rice that popped up in the system. And interestingly enough, this lake and the town, some say, I'm not going to say it's 100%, but some suggest that it did have a huge wild rice component around it when it was a wetland system. So that may be why it was named that way. I'm not going to say that's for sure. Some people say it was because of a local person that came to the town, but nonetheless. So wild rice, you'd think it'd be a benefit to waterfowl hunting, but their main concern is that in front of those duck blinds, that so much vegetation would become established that they would have problems with competing hunters. So they didn't want the vegetation in spite of that, right? So I get this interesting pull. I've got a sportsman that really loves duck hunting, and he knows that the value of emergent vegetation, but yet because of their needs, quote unquote, they didn't want to see that emergent vegetation in in front of their particular property. So it's kind of this NIMBY thing. But I like to think that, yes, many sportsmen and fishermen and you know, anglers in general, and even people who just understand lake ecology a little bit more now, would want to see the vegetation be an important component of that, the emergent vegetation in particular. And I do have a grad student that is trying to work on doing augmenting of wild rice in the system. We'll see how that goes. He's struggling to find some viable seed and stuff, so we'll see how that goes. But nonetheless, it's another piece of the puzzle that's hopefully going to get cured or at least addressed within the next few years.
Eric, this is Jesse Martis from PCA. I was wondering, you know, based on the results you have after the project, if you were can kind of just reinforce your key talking points you think that really would make the case for it, the results that, you know, you seem to get a good response and sort of from the lake association and people that use the lake. Was it the clarity? Was it the vegetation, the fishing? Like if you were to make that case again, you know, the data that you have coming out of it to really justify it and that sort of people rally behind, what are the talking points you would recommend people use on a drawdown again? And that's my first question. The second question is, say there were no impediments, how frequently would you do a drawdown?
Oh boy, these are some big questions, man. I guess I would still point to the water clarity response, the vegetation response, and obviously the phosphorus reduction. The instantaneous phosphorus reduction was pretty dramatic. Those are the three talking points that I started with. Those are the ones I would continue with. That habitat is super, super important. And I still point out that, you know, we have a lot less vegetation than most of these similar style shallow lakes have in central Minnesota. So I would suggest that, you know what, we still got a ways to go. So let's keep on improving on these things, and that would be a good avenue to try and suggest that again, to do the drawdown again. Now, if I had no sideboards, if I had no hydroelectric facility that was of concern and had, you know, was worried about the bottom dollar and all this other stuff, or if they were mandated for whatever reason to do a drawdown, at the very minimum, I would do at least 2 months during the peak growing season. So it'd be July, August timeframe, basically. And if we could get it further down, great. But the lake was kind of limited. It didn't seem like it wanted to go below that 2.7 feet, even though we had farther reduction in the river of exactly 3 feet. Okay, so there was some question as to whether or not we could get any more than, say, a 3-foot drawdown on the lake itself. If everything was done correctly, what I would suggest is we would do a drawdown that started in July and then ended up in June, the following higher water season, or let's say May, when the spring runoff would come through. And basically what that would do is, if we had the drawdown during that time frame, not only would you establish plant growth during the summer, but you would also probably kill quite a few of the turions for the curly leaf pondweed during that time frame, right? And that would allow for a little bit of control of the curly leaf, that's one of the concerns that some of the people have, and something the Lake Association is looking at, even though it's begrudgingly by me anyway, a harvester to do some selective harvest of the areas with the intent of trying to allow from native vegetation to become established more so. So hopefully that answered those two questions.
Great, thanks, Eric. So we just have a few more comments, questions in the chat. Sure. I think maybe we already addressed what the reaction has been from the public since the drawdown with Karen's question, but maybe you could maybe just speak a little more about, you know, do you have happy landowners, or exactly, you know, what has been the majority of the experience or the feeling from the public?
So the Lake Association folks have been largely involved, and I would argue that many of them are appreciative. Like I said, some of them treat those plants like they're their babies, and it's really cool to see. There's a lake gauge reader on the north end of the lake that he kind of describes the water clarity, the conditions around the system, and he's like, the wire reeds up on the north end of Little Rock are doing terrific, and the pink flamingos are guarding them from the geese. So it's stuff like that. It kind of gives you a good feeling. you know, there's many properties around the lakes where they did establish some bulrush, and they're doing very well. So it's kind of fun to see that. And when I talked to one landowner the other day about the potential for planting wild rice, and this person was like, yeah, that'd be kind of neat if we saw wild rice get established again. How is it invasive or anything? So they're curious, which is great. And I think the only frustrating part is that even though we had this high gillnet catch of walleye, some people were having trouble catching them. And then subsequently, we found out that there's a tremendous year class of perch, young of the year buffalo, which is also of interest. And then we also had a fairly decent carp crop this past year. So there's tons and tons of forage, not to mention the spot-tail shiners, among other species of suckers and everything else. So there's lots and lots of food out there. It makes it tough for walleye to bite. So some of the anglers are like, well, yeah, he did his drawdown and then the fishing went to hell. But, other than that, I guess I can't complain. So a lot of positive response from it, honestly.
Awesome. There's also a question on if you plan to document this experience, your lessons learned, in any kind of report or literature, so that others can kind of learn from it.
Yeah, I want to work with both the Lake Group and Benton SWCD to kind of characterize that. I think I don't know if it's paper worthy per se, but certainly, I would be doing a report, and we address it in our lake survey stuff for sure. In those reports, we'll add language. We have added language regarding the drawdown and the overall impacts. This spring, we'll be doing an ice out assessment to determine, the year class strengths of crappie that were established during and or post drawdown, as well as, we'll see sunfish, and we'll take a good look at the bass and stuff again this spring as well. So the monitoring effort is continuing. The reports are probably going to be, I wouldn't say drawdown specific, but certainly as part of our routine monitoring and stuff like that, we'll address a lot of those issues. So unless somebody wants to help me write it.
Great. Well, we will have this recording, so we've got it.
Perfect. All right.
We've got it documented, at least through today's presentation.
Sounds good.
Well, I think we're just about done here. We just had one last, I think it's more of a comment about the
Sure.
competitiveness of duck hunters there. So I don't know that there's any actual question in that one. But I just wanted to thank you for joining us today and sharing your great work and experiences with all of us. We really appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to share this interesting story with us. So thank you so much.
My pleasure.
What an interesting talk, both on the level of the lake drawdown and what it accomplished, and also, talking about, that involvement with the public that you went through, what it took, and what we learned out of that. I mean, that was really an engaging, interesting talk.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for giving it.
My pleasure.